You wake up with a strange feeling, like this day has already happened. Not in detail, not as a memory you can place, but as a sensation. The same weight in the chest, the same thoughts waiting in line, the same sense that something is about to repeat. Nothing is wrong exactly, and that's what makes it unsettling. You get out of bed, move through your routine, and part of you already knows how the day will feel. The conversations, the tensions, the quiet frustrations, different faces, same emotional rhythm. It's as if life keeps pressing replay, but changes the setting just enough for you to doubt it. Most people call this coincidence, bad luck, or personality. Few stop to ask the deeper question, what if this repetition isn't coming from life at all? What if it's coming from something much closer, so close that you've never thought to question it? Most people don't notice the trap at first because it looks like movement. You change cities, you leave a relationship, you start a new job, you tell yourself this time will be different. For a while it feels true. New streets, new faces, new routines. The mind relaxes because novelty gives it hope. But then, quietly, something familiar returns. The same tension in conversations, the same feeling of being unseen, overburdened, disappointed, or misunderstood. Different people, same emotional aftertaste. This is usually the moment when confusion sets in. You look around and try to locate the problem. Was it the city? No, this one is better. Was it the partner? No, this one seemed healthier. Was it the job? No, on paper this is an upgrade. And yet, the internal experience rhymes with the past, not identical but close enough to hurt. It feels like life keeps recycling the same lesson, even though you never signed up for the course. The invisible trap hides in this assumption. That repetition must be caused by external circumstances. We are trained to believe that if something feels wrong, the environment must be wrong. So we rearrange the environment again and again. New house, new social circle, new identity. And none of that is wrong. Change can be healthy. But when the pattern survives every change, something else is clearly at work. What actually repeats is not the situation. It's the position you unconsciously occupy inside the situation. The stance you take, the role you slip into without noticing. You may tell yourself you're starting fresh, but inwardly you bring the same expectations, the same defenses, the same emotional reflexes. Life doesn't need to recreate the exact same event. It only needs to touch the same internal button. Think of it like this. Two people can walk into the same room and experience completely different realities. One feels threatened, the other feels curious. One feels ignored, the other feels free. The room didn't change, the lens did. And that lens is rarely questioned, because it feels personal. It feels like you. This is why changing the outside often fails to produce lasting relief. The loop is not geographical, it's psychological, but deeper than psychology, as we usually understand it. It's not just habits or beliefs, it's identity, the sense of this is who I am in life. Once that identity is in place, reality starts to orbit around it, not because the universe is punishing you, but because perception is selective. You notice what confirms the role you're already playing, and you miss what doesn't. Someone who secretly sees themselves as the one who has to fight for love will keep finding relationships that require struggle. Someone who identifies as the responsible one will keep being surrounded by people who need saving. Someone who believes they are never enough will feel that verdict echoed in 100 subtle ways. Not because life is cruel, but because attention keeps scanning for familiar proof. The trap is invisible because it feels like continuity. It feels like personality. It feels like history. You tell yourself, this is just how my life goes, without realizing you are describing a loop, not a fate. And because the loop has been running for so long, it feels normal. Painful, yes. Exhausting, yes. But normal. There's another layer that makes this even harder to see. When something repeats, the mind assumes it must be teaching you something you haven't learned yet. So you try harder, you analyze more, you self-improve, you look for the missing piece. All the while the loop continues, because the one thing you're not questioning is the identity doing the learning. This is why the trap survives intelligence, effort, and even spiritual curiosity. You can read the books. You can move across the world. You can become more aware, more articulate, more conscious in many ways. And still, the same emotional gravity pulls events into familiar shapes. The character evolves, but the script doesn't. At some point, a quieter suspicion begins to form. Not loud, not dramatic. Just a soft question that arises between repetitions. What if it's not the situation that keeps coming back, but me? Not you as a person, but you as a position, as a role, as a story that keeps inserting itself into new scenes. This is uncomfortable to consider, because it threatens the idea that freedom comes from control. It hints that the loop is not something you escape by running faster or choosing better scenery. It suggests that the repetition is sustained by something you're actively, though unconsciously, holding on to. And if that's true, then the real trap isn't the city, the job, or the relationship. The trap is the belief that you are the one inside the story, rather than the one aware of it. That belief is so intimate, so unquestioned, that it feels like ground, but it's actually the doorway to the next realization. Because once you begin to sense that the role itself might be the source of repetition, a deeper question starts to open, one that quietly undermines the entire loop. Who is the one playing this character in the first place? At the center of every repeating pattern, there is a belief so basic that it almost never gets questioned. It doesn't sound dramatic or philosophical. It sounds ordinary, reasonable, even necessary. The belief is this: I am the character of my story. Not a character, but the character. The one everything happens to. The one who must carry the past, protect the future, and make sense of the present. From the moment you were old enough to understand language, the world began shaping you into someone. You were given a name and taught to answer when it was called. You were praised for certain traits and corrected for others. Slowly a center formed, a sense of this is me and this is not me. And that center became the reference point for everything. Every success was my success. Every failure was my failure. Every wound became part of my story. Over time, this sense of being a character solidified. It gathered memories, explanations, defenses. It learned what to expect and what to fear. It learned which situations felt safe and which felt threatening. And because it wanted continuity, it began stitching the past to the present and the present to the future. The story needed to make sense, so it kept repeating itself in different forms. This is the part most people miss. The loop doesn't exist because life is repetitive. It exists because the character needs consistency. A character without a consistent storyline feels unstable. So even when circumstances change, the internal narrator quietly translates everything back into familiar language. New relationship, same emotional role. New job, same sense of pressure or invisibility. New environment, same inner weather. Believing you are the character means you relate to life as something that happens to you. Events arrive and you react. People speak and you interpret. Situations unfold and you position yourself inside them. The world becomes a stage and you unconsciously ask, what does this mean about me? That question alone keeps the loop alive because it turns every experience into evidence for the story. And the story is rarely neutral. It usually carries an emotional tone learned early on. Maybe it's the story of having to prove yourself, or the story of being overlooked, or the story of always being the strong one. These narratives don't need to be spoken out loud to run your life. They operate silently, shaping what you notice and what you dismiss. When something doesn't fit the story, it often passes by unnoticed. When something confirms it, it feels heavy and real. This is why the loop feels personal. Painful moments don't just hurt, they feel meaningful. They seem to say something about who you are. And because you believe you are the character, you defend the story even when it hurts you. You justify it. You explain it. You adapt to it. You rarely question it, because questioning it feels like questioning your own existence. There's also comfort hidden in this belief. A character has boundaries. A character has a role. Even suffering feels safer when it's familiar. Letting go of the character would mean stepping into something undefined, something without a script. And the mind doesn't like scriptless spaces. It prefers a painful certainty, over an open unknown. So the loop continues, not because you are failing to change, but because you are succeeding at being consistent. You are being loyal to an identity you didn't consciously choose, but learned to inhabit. And every time life offers a moment that could dissolve the pattern, the character steps in to interpret it, categorize it, and fit it neatly back into the narrative. What makes this even more subtle is that the character often improves. It becomes more aware, more refined, more healed. But improvement still assumes identification. The character becomes a better character, not a questioned one. The story becomes more sophisticated, but it's still the same story, just told with better language. At some point, usually not in a dramatic moment, but in a quiet pause, something starts to feel off. You notice that no matter how much you understand your patterns, they keep returning. You can explain them perfectly, yet they still have power. That's when a deeper insight begins to approach, not as an answer but as a disturbance. A subtle discomfort with the assumption that you are the one inside the story. Because if you look closely, the character is always being seen. Thoughts about yourself are noticed. Emotional reactions are noticed. Roles are noticed. And whatever is being noticed cannot be the one doing the noticing. That realization doesn't arrive as a conclusion. It arrives as a crack. And through that crack, the next question quietly forms. If I am aware of the character, what happens when I stop protecting it? Once identification settles in, pain stops being an occasional visitor and becomes a quiet companion. Not always dramatic, not always visible, but persistent. This is the kind of suffering that doesn't scream. It hums in the background of your life. You function. You smile. You handle responsibilities. And yet, something inside stays tight, braced, slightly tired of existing. This happens because identification doesn't just shape how you see yourself. It shapes how pain is processed. When an experience hurts and you believe you are the character, the pain doesn't simply pass through you. It sticks. It becomes personal. It becomes meaningful. Instead of being an event, it becomes evidence. A harsh comment isn't just a harsh comment. It becomes proof that you are not respected. A distance in a relationship isn't just a moment of disconnect. It becomes confirmation that you are hard to love. A failure isn't just a failure. It becomes a verdict on who you are. Each moment feeds the same identity, and the identity feeds on the moment. That's the cycle. What makes this suffering silent is that it often looks normal. You don't collapse, you adapt. You learn how to carry the weight without dropping it. Over time, this adaptation gets praised. People call you resilient, strong, grounded, and in a way you are. But resilience can hide repetition. Strength can hide self-abandonment. The cycle continues not because it's unbearable, but because it's bearable enough. Identification creates roles, and roles demand consistency. If you see yourself as the one who gets overlooked, you unconsciously lower your expectation of being seen. If you see yourself as the caretaker, you ignore your own needs before they even reach the surface. If you see yourself as the one who must endure, you normalize exhaustion. Pain becomes familiar, and familiarity starts to feel like truth. This is where suffering deepens, not in intensity, but in duration. It stretches across years. It becomes a tone rather than a spike. And because it's always there, it rarely gets questioned. You don't ask, why does this keep hurting? You ask, how do I manage this better? That question assumes the pain is part of who you are. Identification also narrows perception. You don't experience the full range of what happens to you. You experience what fits the role. Moments of ease pass quickly. Compliments slide off. Opportunities feel undeserved. But anything that confirms the identity lands heavily. The mind highlights it, replays it, stores it. This selective attention isn't intentional. It's automatic. It's how the character stays alive. And because the suffering feels self-generated, it often comes with shame. You tell yourself you shouldn't feel this way. Others have it worse. You should be grateful. So the pain goes underground. You don't express it fully. You don't even think about it clearly. It becomes a background pressure that colors your decisions without announcing itself. This is why the cycle feels so hard to interrupt. There is no obvious enemy, No single moment you can point to and say, that's where it all went wrong. The suffering is spread thin, woven into daily life. It shows up as overthinking at night, as tension in conversations, as a constant sense of effort even during rest. What's actually happening is subtle but precise. Each time pain arises, identification steps in and says, this is about me. And the moment it becomes about you, it gains a second life. The initial sensation may last seconds or minutes. The story about it can last years. That story gets carried forward, shaping expectations before the next situation even begins. Over time, this creates emotional predictability. You may not know exactly what will happen, but you know how it will feel, and that familiarity can be mistaken for intuition. You think you're being realistic, grounded, prepared, but in truth, you're rehearsing the same emotional response again and again, long before anything actually occurs. The most painful part is that the suffering feels justified. It feels earned. You can trace it back to experiences, memories, disappointments. The character has a long resume of reasons, and because those reasons are real events, the identification feels unquestionable. Letting go of the role can feel like denying your own history, but something important is often overlooked. Pain that comes from identification doesn't need new causes to survive. It only needs recognition. The moment you believe the pain says something about who you are, it settles in and waits. It doesn't demand attention loudly. It waits for the next opportunity to be confirmed. At a certain point, you may notice that even when nothing is wrong, something still feels off. The suffering no longer depends on circumstances. It has become internalized. This is usually when people start searching for deeper explanations, deeper tools, deeper fixes. But what's rarely questioned is the mechanism itself, the way the mind wraps experience around an identity and calls it me. And beneath all of this pain, beneath the repetition and the quiet endurance, there is a hidden activity taking place. The mind is working hard to protect the character, to justify its reactions, to keep the story coherent. It believes it is keeping you safe. It doesn't realize it is also keeping the suffering alive. The mind has a talent that is both impressive and dangerous. It knows how to turn a cage into a shelter, not by lying outright, but by reframing. It tells you that what limits you is actually what keeps you safe. And because protection feels necessary, you cooperate without realizing you're reinforcing the very structure that confines you. Every identity comes with a set of rules. What you allow yourself to feel, what you avoid, how close you let people get, what risks are too much. The mind presents these rules as wisdom gained from experience. You've been hurt before. Be careful. You know how this ends. Don't be naive. These thoughts sound reasonable, they sound mature, they sound like self-respect. But beneath them is a quiet contraction, a narrowing of life. The mind's trick works because it uses memory as evidence. It pulls up moments of pain and says, see, this is why we stay alert. And in one sense, it's not wrong. Pain did happen, loss did occur. But the conclusion it draws is subtle and absolute. This is who you must be now. From that point on, protection becomes identity. Caution becomes personality. Distance becomes strength. You begin to defend patterns not because they feel good, but because they feel necessary. You justify staying emotionally guarded by calling it boundaries. You justify staying small by calling it humility. You justify constant control by calling it responsibility. Each defense has a noble label, which makes it hard to see the fear underneath. The prison doesn't feel like a prison when it's padded with explanations. What makes this even more convincing is that the mind truly believes it's helping you. It's not trying to trap you, it's trying to prevent pain from repeating. But in doing so, it assumes that pain comes from exposure, not from identification. So it tightens the walls, it limits vulnerability, it avoids uncertainty. And slowly, life becomes predictable, manageable, and slightly lifeless. You might notice this in small moments. You hesitate before speaking honestly. You hold back excitement so you won't be disappointed. You dismiss opportunities before they can reject you. Each time, The mind steps in quickly, almost kindly. Better safe than sorry. And because the regret of holding back is quieter than the pain of being hurt, the strategy seems to work. But protection has a cost that's rarely acknowledged. The same walls that block pain also block depth. The same defenses that prevent disappointment also prevent surprise. Over time, you don't just avoid suffering, you avoid aliveness. And because this happens gradually, it doesn't feel like loss. It feels like adulthood, like being realistic, like knowing better. The mind also protects the character by controlling interpretation. When something challenges your identity, it quickly reframes it. If someone sees you differently than you see yourself, the mind dismisses their view. If an experience threatens to soften you, the mind calls it dangerous. If a moment invites surrender, the mind labels it irresponsible. This constant filtering keeps the character intact and unquestioned. And here's the deeper trick. The more you defend the prison, the more you believe you need it. Each act of self-protection becomes proof that the world is unsafe. Each avoidance reinforces the idea that something bad would happen if you let go. The walls feel justified because they've never been tested. The mind says, "See? Nothing terrible happened," without noticing that nothing fully happened at all. This is why advice to just let go rarely works. The mind hears that as a threat. Letting go feels like removing armor in the middle of a battlefield. Even when the battlefield exists only in memory, the body still reacts. Tightness, alertness, control. The nervous system has learned that safety equals vigilance. What's rarely seen is that the prison is guarded from the inside. No one is forcing you to maintain it. The mind volunteers. It scans, predicts, compares, and corrects, all in the name of protection. And because these activities happen so quickly, they feel automatic. You don't experience them as choices. You experience them as just how I am. At some point, a subtle contradiction starts to appear. You notice that despite all the protection, you don't feel truly safe. You feel managed. You feel contained. The suffering hasn't disappeared. It has just become quieter and more internal. The mind promised relief but delivered tension. It promised safety but delivered vigilance. This is often when curiosity begins to replace effort. Not curiosity about how to fix yourself, but curiosity about the mechanism itself. You start to notice the voice that warns, that tightens, that explains. You see how quickly it reacts, how little space it allows. And for the first time, a different possibility flickers. What if the mind isn't an enemy, but it's also not the authority? What if the one who notices the guarding is not the one who needs guarding? There is a blind spot at the center of your experience, and it's not there because you're unaware or unobservant. It's there because it's too close. What you call me sits so near to perception that it feels like the perceiver itself, and because of that, it rarely becomes an object of inquiry. You don't look at it, you look from it. Most of what you consider to be yourself is a collection of movements. Thoughts commenting on life, emotions reacting to events, memories offering context, impulses pushing or pulling you in certain directions. These movements feel intimate. They happen in your own inner voice. They respond instantly, so you assume they are you. But none of them are stable. They come and go, change tone, contradict each other. And yet something remains constant enough to notice all of this. The blind spot forms when attention habitually collapses into the content of experience. A thought arises, and attention fuses with it. An emotion appears, and attention sinks into the feeling. In those moments, there is no distance. There is only identification. You don't notice the thought, you become the thought. You don't sense the emotion, you are the emotion. And from inside that fusion, it feels obvious that this is who you are. But there are cracks in this assumption, even if you've never named them. You've noticed thoughts contradicting each other. You've noticed emotions passing without your permission. You've noticed reactions happening before you decide anything. If you were truly these things, you would have full control over them. Yet they behave more like weather than like identity. What's rarely noticed is the silent presence that remains when thoughts pause, even briefly. Not in meditation, not in some special state, but in ordinary moments. A pause before a response. A gap between two thoughts. a stillness that appears when you're absorbed in something simple. That presence doesn't announce itself, it doesn't comment, it doesn't define, it simply is. And because it doesn't have a voice, it's often overlooked. The mind is quick to fill that silence with meaning. It rushes in and says, "That was nothing," or "That doesn't count." But something did count. You were there, aware without a story. That awareness didn't feel like a character. It didn't feel like a role. It felt like space, like openness, like a quiet capacity to experience whatever came next. This is the blind spot. You keep mistaking what appears for the one in which it appears. You call the voice in your head me, but you are aware of that voice. You call your emotions me, but you can watch them shift and dissolve. You call your history me, but you are here now, aware of remembering. None of these can be the observer, because they are being observed. And yet, the habit of identification is strong. The mind insists, if I am not my thoughts, then who am I? It demands an answer in the same language it uses to create the problem. It wants a new concept, a new identity, a new label, but the blind spot cannot be filled with a label. The moment you name it, you turn it into another object. This is why the recognition doesn't come as an answer, but as a shift, a slight reorientation of attention. Instead of focusing on what's happening, attention relaxes into the fact that it's happening. Instead of chasing experience, it rests as the space in which experience unfolds. Nothing dramatic changes on the surface. Life continues, thoughts continue, emotions continue, but the center quietly moves. From this shift, something subtle becomes obvious. The you you've been protecting, improving, and defending is a construct made of experiences, not the experiencer itself. It has shape, history, and texture, but it's not the ground of awareness, it's content. And content, no matter how personal, comes and goes. The mind resists this at first, not because it's false, but because it destabilizes its authority. If you are not the character, then many of its strategies lose their urgency. Its fears lose their grip. Its justifications lose their weight. And the mind, whose job has been to manage the character, doesn't know what to do with that freedom. This recognition doesn't erase the character. It simply places it in context. The thoughts still speak, the emotions still arise, the roles still function. But they are no longer mistaken for the whole. They are seen as movements within awareness, not the owner of awareness. At first, this can feel disorienting. There is less certainty about who you are, but also less tension around defending it. The familiar reference point softens, and in that softening, a new kind of curiosity appears. If the voice, the emotions, and the story are not you, then what happens when they don't need to be fixed or protected? What happens when they are simply noticed? This is where the next misunderstanding often arises. The mind quickly tries to use this insight to create a better version of itself, to manage awareness, to control identification. But that too is another movement to be seen. Because the blind spot doesn't disappear by effort, it reveals itself only when attention stops clinging to the idea of being someone at all. When a certain clarity begins to appear, many people feel a rush of relief. There is a sense that something fundamental has been seen. The constant tension loosens, even if only slightly, and almost immediately, the mind steps in with a plan. It takes this new understanding and turns it into a project. The project sounds spiritual, mature, even wise. Now I need to change my ego. This is the most common mistake after an awakening glimpse, not because it's wrong to grow or refine yourself, but because the effort is misdirected. The mind assumes the problem was the ego itself, so the solution must be a better version of it, a calmer ego, a more conscious ego, a spiritual ego. And without realizing it, the game restarts on a more subtle level. At first, this feels like progress. You watch your reactions more closely, you catch negative thoughts, you try to replace them with positive ones, you monitor your emotions and judge which ones are lower or higher. You become more aware but also more self-conscious. The inner commentary doesn't disappear, it multiplies. Now there is a voice reacting and another voice evaluating the reaction. The ego loves this phase because it gets to survive under a new identity. It is no longer the wounded character, it is the awakened one, the one who knows, the one who is working on themselves. This identity feels lighter, but it's still an identity. It still needs maintenance, it still needs confirmation, and it still creates subtle loops of comparison, success, and failure. Trying to change the ego keeps you inside the same structure that created the suffering. The structure of someone who needs to arrive somewhere, someone who needs to fix something about themselves, someone who believes that peace is a result of effort applied correctly. The tools change, the language becomes softer, but the underlying assumption remains untouched. I am the one who must become different. This is why many people feel exhausted after years of inner work. They are constantly adjusting, correcting, refining. They celebrate moments of calm and criticize moments of reactivity. They measure themselves against ideals of presence, compassion, and awareness. And each measurement quietly reinforces the sense of being a character on a path. There is nothing wrong with awareness practices. The issue arises when awareness is used as a tool to control experience rather than to see through the controller. The moment you try to manage the ego, you have already assumed it is you. You've given it the role of operator, not the role of object. Leaving the game doesn't mean destroying the ego or getting rid of it. It means seeing it clearly as a function, not an identity. Thoughts still arise. Preferences still exist. Personality still operates. But they are no longer treated as a self that must be perfected. They are seen as movements within experience, useful at times, irrelevant at others. The mind struggles with this because it wants a task, it wants a direction, it wants something to do. Seeing that there is nothing to fix feels almost irresponsible. It can feel like giving up. But what's actually being given up is the belief that you are the manager of life. In this phase, confusion often appears. You may wonder, if I'm not trying to change myself, am I just going to stay the same? That question assumes that change only happens through control. But notice how much in your life has already changed without your permission. Your tastes, your beliefs, your fears, your understanding. Life evolves on its own. The ego only takes credit after the fact. The more you try to improve the character, the more attention you give it. And attention is what keeps it solid. When attention relaxes, the character doesn't disappear, but it loses its central position. It becomes a tool rather than a master. You still respond to emails, have conversations, make decisions. But there is less internal narration around who you are while doing so. This is where many people get stuck. They hover between insight and effort. They see through identification in moments, then rush back in to optimize it. They experience freedom briefly, then try to capture it. And the attempt to capture it is what collapses it. Leaving the game is not an action. It's a non-action. It's the recognition that the one trying to leave was never inside in the first place. But that recognition can't be forced. It reveals itself in moments when effort drops, when the urge to become something softens, when awareness rests without agenda. As this becomes more familiar, something unexpected begins to happen. The ego doesn't need to be changed because it stops being taken so seriously. Its movements are noticed sooner, its reactions are lighter. And instead of trying to correct them, there is space around them. That space is important because it sets the stage for the next shift. When you are no longer busy improving the character, you begin to notice something else entirely. You notice what happens when identification loosens on its own. You notice how situations start to lose their grip. And you begin to sense the moment when the game doesn't just become quieter, but starts to short-circuit altogether. The collapse doesn't arrive with fireworks. There is no dramatic moment where everything explodes into light or certainty. Most of the time it arrives quietly, almost unnoticed, in the middle of an ordinary situation. You're listening to someone speak. You're walking down a familiar street. You're sitting alone with a thought. And then, without effort, something clicks. It's not a new thought. It's the absence of one that usually shows up. The inner commentary doesn't rush in to label, defend, or prepare. For a brief moment, there is no reminder of who you are supposed to be in this situation. There is only what is happening, and the simple fact of being aware of it. In that moment, the game short-circuits because its main power source is missing. Identification isn't being fed, the character isn't being referenced, and without that reference, the usual chain reaction fails to start. A trigger appears, but the emotional cascade doesn't follow. A familiar situation arises, but the old response doesn't activate. This can feel strange at first, almost wrong. You may notice a pause where there used to be tension, a softness where there used to be control. The mind may quickly try to step back in and explain what's happening. But even that explanation feels secondary. Something more fundamental has shifted. What collapses is not the personality or the functioning of daily life. What collapses is the assumption that everything must pass through me. Experience stops being filtered through the question, what does this mean about who I am? And without that question, the loop has nothing to organize itself around. You might notice that situations you once dreaded now feel neutral. Not pleasant, not unpleasant, just simple. The emotional charge drains out of them as if someone quietly pulled the plug. It's not suppression. It's not detachment. It's the absence of the glue that used to bind sensation to story. This is why the collapse feels less like an achievement and more like a relief. There is no sense of, I did it. In fact, the feeling of being the doer is noticeably absent. Things are still happening. Decisions are still made. Words still come out of your mouth. But there is less effort behind them. They arise and resolve on their own. Triggers are a clear indicator of this shift. A situation that once guaranteed a reaction now produces a delay. And in that delay, the reaction often dissolves before it fully forms. You can almost watch it lose momentum, like a wave that never quite reaches the shore. The body relaxes before the mind can build a story. What's important to understand is that this doesn't happen because you mastered a technique. It happens because something unnecessary dropped away. Identification relaxed. Attention stopped collapsing into the character. And without that contraction, the system reorganized itself naturally. The mind may try to claim this moment. It may say, this is it, or I've arrived, or now I need to maintain this. That's the game attempting to reboot. But if you look closely, you'll notice that the collapse itself didn't require maintenance. It happened when effort stopped, not when it increased. There is often a sense of surprise here, not excitement, but quiet astonishment. So, this is how it works. You realize that the loop was never as solid as it seemed. It was sustained moment by moment through identification. And when that identification is absent, even briefly, the entire structure loses coherence. Life doesn't suddenly become perfect. Challenges still arise, pain still appears. But something essential has changed in the way experience moves through you. It no longer accumulates, it no longer defines. It passes through without sticking, like sound through open space. This can feel unsettling because the familiar reference points are gone. The usual inner landmarks that told you who you were and how you were doing are no longer reliable. There is more openness, but also less narrative. The mind may feel unanchored, unsure of how to orient itself. And this is where many people rush to create a new identity, the one who had the collapse, the one who is now free. But if you stay with the simplicity of the moment, you'll notice that freedom here is not something you possess. It's something that happens when possession stops. The short circuit doesn't eliminate the game forever in a dramatic way. The game may attempt to restart. Identification may return in waves. But now there is recognition. You've seen that the loop is not inevitable. You've felt what happens when it isn't powered. This recognition sets the stage for a deeper question, one that arises naturally after the collapse. When the character is no longer at the center and the game loses its grip, a quiet uncertainty emerges, not fearful, but open. If I am not the one inside the story, and the story can dissolve, then what remains when nothing needs to happen at all? After the collapse, a question appears that feels different from all the others. It doesn't come from confusion or insecurity. It doesn't demand an immediate answer. It arises quietly, almost respectfully from the space that's been revealed. If I'm not the character, then who am I? The mind wants to answer this question the way it answers everything else. It searches for a definition, a concept, a spiritual label, awareness, consciousness, witness, presence. The words appear quickly and they sound right, but none of them actually satisfy the question. They describe something, but they don't touch the felt sense of what's being noticed. That's because this question isn't meant to be answered mentally. The moment you turn it into a concept, you move away from the very thing you're trying to understand. The question points not to an idea, but to an experience that's already here, something so obvious that it's usually ignored. When the character steps out of the center, what remains is not a void. It's a presence, not dramatic, not mystical, just quietly there. You notice that experience is happening and you are aware of it. Sounds arise, sensations move, thoughts come and go, and through all of it, there is a simple knowing that doesn't change. This knowing doesn't have a personality. It doesn't comment. It doesn't judge. It doesn't feel proud of being noticed. It doesn't feel threatened by uncertainty. It has no agenda. And because it has no agenda, the mind doesn't know what to do with it. At first, this can feel unsettling. The mind is used to orienting itself around roles, preferences, and stories. Without those, it feels like standing without landmarks. You may notice a subtle urge to grab onto something familiar, even a spiritual idea, just to regain a sense of ground. But if you don't rush, something else becomes clear. This presence doesn't need grounding. It is the ground. It doesn't need reassurance. It's not waiting for anything to happen. It's already complete in its simplicity. The discomfort comes from the mind trying to stand where it doesn't belong. There is often a sense of intimacy here. Not emotional intimacy, but existential. Everything feels closer, not because you're attached, but because there's less distance created by thought. You're not observing life from behind a character anymore. Life is happening in open awareness, without a center trying to manage it. This doesn't mean you lose your personality or your preferences. They still function. You still like what you like. You still respond as yourself in practical ways. But those traits feel lighter. They don't define you. They're expressions, not identities. The question, "Who am I?" begins to dissolve not because it's answered, but because it's no longer necessary. The urgency behind it fades. You see that whatever you truly are doesn't need a name. It's present before every name and remains after each one fades. Silence becomes more noticeable, not as an absence of sound, but as the background in which sound appears. Stillness becomes familiar, even while movement continues. You start to recognize yourself not as something inside experience, but as the openness that allows experience to appear at all. This recognition doesn't feel like owning something new. It feels like remembering something old. Something that was always there but overlooked because it was too close, too simple, too unremarkable for the mind to grasp. And yet, this simplicity can be confusing. The mind may protest, "This can't be it. It's too ordinary." But that protest is just another thought, appearing in the same awareness as everything else. It doesn't disturb what you are. It's included. As this becomes clearer, you may notice a subtle shift in how life is lived. There's less effort to position yourself, less need to protect an image, less concern about outcomes defining you. Actions happen, but they're not burdened with the weight of self-definition. Still, something remains unresolved. Even with this recognition, life continues to move. Decisions are made, words are spoken, relationships unfold, and a new curiosity arises, not from lack, but from openness. If this presence is what I am, how does it live? How does it move in the world without falling back into the old game? That question doesn't demand an answer right away. It invites observation. It invites patience. Because what comes next is not about understanding yourself more deeply, but about discovering how life expresses itself when no one is trying to be someone. What often surprises people most is not the recognition itself, but what follows it. There is a quiet assumption that once the loop dissolves, everything settles into a permanent state of ease, that the story ends and peace simply remains. And for a while, there may be a sense of lightness, even relief. But then life keeps moving. Situations arise, choices need to be made, emotions still appear, and it becomes clear that what felt like liberation was not an ending. It was an opening. The twist is this: freedom doesn't remove you from life. It removes the weight you were carrying about life. The old burden of being someone who had to get it right, defend a story, or avoid repeating the past is gone. But action still happens. Responsibility still exists. The difference is subtle but profound. There is no longer a psychological past being dragged into each moment. Without identification, experience becomes fresh in a way that's hard to describe until it's felt. A conversation is just a conversation. A challenge is just a challenge. There is no echo from old roles asking, "What does this say about me?" The mind may still offer commentary, but it doesn't dominate the experience. It feels more like background noise than command. This is where many people get confused. They expect constant calm, constant clarity. When discomfort shows up, they wonder if they've lost something. But discomfort now moves differently. It arises, registers, and passes without creating a storyline. It doesn't accumulate. It doesn't define. It doesn't turn into identity. Living from this space requires no effort, but it does require honesty. You can no longer hide behind stories about who you are or why you act a certain way. Without a character to protect, actions become more transparent. When you're tired, you feel tired. When you're unsure, you feel unsure. There's no need to cover these states with explanations or self-judgment. The beginning that unfolds here is not dramatic. It's deeply ordinary. And that ordinariness is what makes it real. You find yourself responding more simply, listening more fully, speaking without rehearsing who you need to be. There is less performance and more participation. One of the most noticeable changes is how the past loses its authority. Memories still exist, but they no longer dictate your posture toward the present. You can remember without reliving. You can learn without carrying. The past becomes information, not a lens. This doesn't mean patterns will never try to return. They may. Habit has momentum, but now when an old pattern appears, it's seen early. It doesn't sneak in wearing the mask of identity. It's recognized as a movement, not a truth. And recognition alone is often enough to prevent it from taking over. What also changes is your relationship with uncertainty. Before, uncertainty felt threatening because it endangered the character's plans and expectations. Now, uncertainty feels open. Not always comfortable, but no longer hostile. You don't need to know who you'll become next because you're no longer invested in becoming someone in particular. This is where life starts to feel lighter, not because it's easier, but because it's no longer filtered through constant self-reference. Attention moves outward naturally. You notice details, you notice people, you notice the texture of moments. Presence stops being a practice and becomes the default. And yet, this is only the beginning because this way of living keeps revealing depth, not in the form of insights but in sensitivity. You become more attuned to subtle signals in the body, in conversations, in decisions. Action arises from clarity rather than from habit. There is also a quiet humility here. Without a character to claim progress, there's no sense of having arrived. Life isn't something you've figured out. It's something you're participating in, moment by moment without needing to own the experience. What once felt like a game you had to win now reveals itself as something you were never meant to complete. The rules were self-imposed, the pressure was imagined, and now without effort you move without carrying the scoreboard. This is the real twist. Liberation doesn't give you a new identity or a permanent state. It gives you back your capacity to meet each moment without the past leaning into it. And from that place, life doesn't feel like a problem to solve or a loop to escape. It feels like a living process, unfolding on its own, with no need for a player at the center. When the character disappears, the loop dissolves. Not because life suddenly becomes perfect, but because there is no longer a someone repeating the past. The story loses its grip, the weight lifts. What remains is not empty and not new. It is the quiet presence that was there before every role, every struggle, every attempt to become someone. This is not an escape from life. It is a return to it, a way of moving without carrying yesterday into every moment, a way of responding without rehearsing who you need to be. Nothing mystical, just real freedom, lived simply. If this resonated, write this sentence in the comments so I know you stayed until the end. I am not the character. And if this content speaks to you and you want to go deeper, watch one of the videos appearing on your screen now. They continue this exploration in a clear, practical way.